So now that I've gone all over and added some value structure, I am going back in and doing one more stump. The first stumping just didn't have enough variety to it. So remember, what I did lay down was so light that it was a top layer. So what I'm doing now is not really grinding it into the paper. I'm actually just kind of pushing around that little top layer. And this will never be my final layer. You know, this is just such a broad and general kind of moving around that there's always going to need to be some modification after this stage. And I think actually a lot of students will get to a point where they stump something like this and think that the values are close enough together to leave it and continue on to somewhere else with the drawing. But it ends up being just kind of not finished enough at this stage. So I am going to need to introduce some more subtlety in here. And I think that's something that you really have to train yourself, again, to start to see and never be satisfied with it looking just the way it is. If you think after this stage that your drawing looks fine, I think it's important that you take a break and walk away, come back, and then reassess to see if there's anywhere where you can develop it, because odds are there is. Keep in mind too that the charcoal is so light that I could probably just tap some of it with my finger and it would come off. It's not like those earlier stages where we really stumped it in to be quite firm before we dragged it across the paper. And then I'm going to go back in these eraser marks that I make now to start to pull back some of these light values. They're going to be pretty light. I'm not going to try to crank down into the paper. I'm going to build them up in veils, just like I would build up veils with the pencil here. Really trying to fine-tune the value relationships. And if you need to, you can sharpen your pencil or your eraser. A lot of people opt for that just to get those finer marks. Or some will use that little mono eraser that has the finer head on it. It's just a little more flexible. And you know, I do want a firm point here because I want to control very precisely the amount of pressure that goes on there. And instead of erasing, I generally just tend to try to feel where the point of that eraser tip is just by wiping it off on the side. And every couple marks here, you see me actually pull my eraser off, and I'm wiping it off, cleaning off right there the charcoal that's built up, and then feeling where that contact point is. Here I am starting to think a bit more about anatomy. My eraser marks are trying to follow across and with the form, a lot like we would do with the white chalk, because technically it's more of a light side, so I want it to come forward a little bit more. So instead of just receding and having no observable direction of the marks, I'll actually try to allow these marks to follow with and across the form, just to build some of the sculptural quality of the muscles in here. One of the challenges with the leg here, as opposed to some of the other pieces of anatomy on this particular pose, is that there's not a whole lot of hard edges here. You'll notice almost everything on this leg is a soft edge, at most maybe a firm edge, which is probably where this cast shadow is that I'm starting to define right now. And so I have to be sensitive to that. I have to actually look back at the other pieces of the drawing and relate the edges as I'm building them up to the other pieces of the drawing. If I, for example, become too formulaic or too standard with the edge quality here, like we kind of were with the anatomy drawings, then this leg is going to pull forward too much, and it's not going to recede to look like a leg that's a little bit further away. So we do have to pay special attention, you know, not have as many sharp edges within the context of the leg as I have in some of the other areas. But again, I don't want them to be softer just to have them recede, because that tends to be more of a formulaic idea. They are softer, and it does help it recede, and I recognize that, but I don't want to fall into that dogmatic sort of solution of handling everything. Observation has to be my primary influence here, and just understanding that there's potential for the edges to be softer because it's in shadow and because it's receding is going to allow me to make better decisions about my observations. And I think that's really the key here. I mean, a lot of people watch these videos, not just these videos, but by any other artist, and they tend to pick up on little tiny snippets. Things like, oh, if you soften out an edge, it helps the form turn away, or if you increase the contrast, it helps to pull it forward. Little things like that, and students often try to apply them to a lot of situations where they wouldn't be applicable, just because the artist did in a demonstration or a video. And to be fair, an artist might use those all the time, maybe just because the subject matter and the lighting conditions that they paint are almost pretty standard or typical, and they're not opting for vast amounts of variety in their work. Most artists have a specific feel to their work, so you have to be very careful about which of those little pieces you're taking away, and understand that those are always good things to look out for, but you should never apply a little tidbit of information from one specific instance and try and make it fit into another piece if it doesn't.
And almost like blindly using that information.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that is an unfortunate thing about any instructional video you get, is that you're kind of going to get a process, and you're going to get some of these tricks and things that the artist is using, or at very least you're going to see the filtration of what the decisions are by the artist. And we can't just blindly follow. It's not like a recipe in so much where we just do all these elements and we're going to get a good drawing. There really are just a stepping stone for us to make decisions. And ultimately, any drawing or painting is going to come down to your decision and problem-solving ability. And if we blindly follow and never question why, then unfortunately we're going to end up never really understanding our process and never really understanding why things are working or not working.
Yeah, there's going to be some major disconnection throughout your whole piece if you're thinking in that way, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it happens all the time in class too, where I'll be saying something to one student on one side of the room because it applies to a particular situation, and then another student on the other side of the room will hear it and then get confused about it because they might try to apply it to their situation when they can't. And we have to be really discerning about which of these little factoids or tips or shortcuts or whatever you want to call them apply to our situation, which of these observations are going to apply to our situation. Because ultimately, you don't need to know any of those tricks. You don't need to know anything about what's making form recede or what's making form come forward, because if you observe the relationships correctly enough, everything will happen on its own. You don't have to fake anything. You don't have to push anything. You don't have to do any of that sort of stuff. It's all going to happen quite naturally. It's just that understanding why things happen can aid our observation. And so that's why we take classes like this. It's to improve our awareness of not just our process, but of everything around us. And we just have to be careful about it. I was always the type of person, especially in school, who always asked why. What's the purpose of doing this? Yeah, why should I do this? What's the benefit? And not just why should I do it, but what are the things that are making it work? I'm interested in knowing that. And that's one reason why I think I can teach this, is because I went through all the trouble to understand all of this and figure out why it's happening and learn when it applies and when it doesn't and all that sort of stuff. But some students just aren't quite there yet. And some students just need a process and need to go slow and steady. And they can get confused really easily. And if you're the type of person who does get confused, especially when we're trying to figure out all of this, shape, value, edge measuring, and everything all together. I would encourage you to rely more and more off of your observation and less off of little tidbits of factoids or whatever that you may have heard or learned about that will help you, quote unquote, improve your drawing or make it more lifelike or anything like that. You have to toss those out the window, develop our perception and our understanding of nature, and then we can start to bring some of those back into play. And maybe they'll make our drawings and paintings come along more efficiently, hopefully. Because that's all those really are,
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've noticed that in my work too, even in the last couple of years, the quality may have improved a little bit, but not a huge amount with all of this knowledge. It's mostly the efficiency with which everything's done. I could paint a great demo in 4 hours a couple years ago. But now I can paint the same great demo in 2 hours because just my understanding and my knowledge are backing up my observations, and so they're coming into play together. And it's not intended to be a shortcut thing. It's just that it's more efficient that way. You've climbed the learning curve and you understand things a lot more, so it takes you less time to do it the next time around.
Yeah, the experience.
And it's just a lot of practice there. Yeah. And I think that's one of the struggles that students have too. Is they feel like they've gone through this or they've watched these videos, they understand all this stuff. So they think it should come a lot easier than it does, but you're having to work through all the problems every single time, and if you don't have a lot of practice working through all those problems, it's just going to take a long time to do it. So 20 hours on a figure drawing like this might not be enough time. You might need to spend 50 or 80 or 100 or more until you develop the practice and the experience and the speed. And speed will be useless if you're just shortcutting all of your observations and shortcutting your measurements to be faster. So add in some white chalk there, just a little bit. That was a tough decision. You can see on the top of the foot, I did go back and forth a bit on how dark and how light it was. Ultimately, I did decide to go with some white chalk. Partly it's because the value of the foot there in the reference, it's just dancing the border of the value of my paper, and that always makes those decisions pretty hard. And I could have added some background value to match the background value, which would have made that decision a little bit easier. But I think at this point I've decided I want to keep the drawing a little bit cleaner, and I'm starting to understand that because of the amount of time I've spent on here with the model now, I will not have enough time to be able to put a whole background in with the model there. So I'm trying to be a little bit more conservative about what I'm putting around the model for context. I have erased out a little bit of the reflected light, reinforced a little bit of the core on that leg, maybe even a bit more, just a hair more than we can see in the reference photo. The reference photo did drop the values. Pretty much anything below a value 3 or 4, it's unclear in the reference photo what that value is. So I'm actually relying on my observation of the model at this point, and the reference photo wouldn't give me all of the information that I need unless I would have bracketed the photo, which is something we talk about in the demonstration video on working from photos. Printing out a photo of different exposures so we can see the information at different values. So that means if you're working from this reference photo at home, you're going to have to be really sensitive with your observations, really try to see all the little value steps in there. And maybe enforce some of the core shadows just a little bit to help give it a little bit more form. All right, now I am not working with the model anymore, if I recall correctly. This is just my final little cleanup phase. I'll go through here, get everything nice and smooth and even. Then I'll come back with one final session with the model where I'll spend just the first sitting finishing up, fine-tuning the values of this leg before moving on to the face and finishing the face off. And one of the things you'll notice about this video is that the primary amount of time is spent on the figure, not a whole lot of time is spent on the head. What we're going to see in this voiceover is less than 45 minutes to render out a whole head and resolve the background, which translates into one sitting or actually less than one sitting with the model. And that's just important to note because for this assignment, we do want the stress of the assignment to be the figure, with this idea of exploring and fleshing out anatomy and working on finishes to develop a high-quality figure drawing. And we don't want the focus to turn into a portrait drawing, which is, that's something that we actually saw very first term in the academy when we tried to run it, because we tried to do that traditional method of starting at the head and then working our way down. But because people just didn't have the experience working with the head, they would spend 3 weeks on a shadow map of the head. And then they'd really run out of time when it came to the rest of the figure, and we just didn't get any work done. And by weeks, I should say sessions, 3 sessions on the head out of the 7-session drawing. And so, that's kind of why we switched gears and started working on the whole figure first, adding the head the last day, because by then the students have had 10 weeks of class and working in portrait, and so hopefully their skills with portrait will have increased by the time we work out the rest of the figure drawing. And that's the intent there. So as far as amount of time distribution, if we were to do this on our own, that's kind of what we'd want to see, only a reasonable amount of time spent on the head, not something like half of the amount of time this figure drawing spent on the head. And if you do that, you'll just end up finding, if you're spending half the time on the head, the rest of the figure is just not going to be resolved.
And that's part of the reason why you set the model up in the way you did, correct? I mean, her face is mostly in shadow and...
yeah, although, she's in a profile Purdue pose, which for me tends to be the most challenging just because of the subtlety involved. I think it's far more challenging than a model looking straight at us. But there's a lot of simplification there because a lot of the face is in shadow, which is nice. So it's a matter of if you can actually figure out the contour of that profile Purdue, it comes along quite quickly, which it did. So it worked out, but I think it would be far too subtle of a pose of the model's head for most students to be able to handle, at least for their first run through. But yeah, normally we will set the head in a fair amount of shadow, or maybe even do a back pose. Back poses are great because then we just get to focus on the figure, and especially if it's your first time through. Again, this is sped up 8 times, so it's just a lot of little patient filling in of dots here.
When you're filling in the dots of a shadow that's this deep, are you using a 6B or a 2B?
Actually, I think it's an HB at this point.
Really?
Well, because we'll keep in mind the shadows here are not actually as black as we think. Yeah. We're dealing with maybe a value 4 or 5 is all in the majority of the shadows. And I, of course, will opt to slowly build up to the values that I need as opposed to potentially overshooting them. And so I think for the most part, this whole run-through is an HB, even on this paper, which is a darker paper. And then it's just the veiling on top that's done with the 2B. So it's, unless we're dealing with really, really deep darks, maybe that fabric, if I had time to render that fabric, I'd probably be filling in some dots in the shadows with the 2B. Yeah, it's definitely one of the things about figure drawing that we tend to miss. Either we just don't go deep enough and everything just ends up being too light and too high key, or we tend to see something like this case where the shadow side is really clearly defined, and we tend to toss it way too dark. And it can be tricky too, because on the picture-in-picture, you might actually think that those shadows are actually pretty dark. But part of the reason for that is that it is so small, actually. And if we were to blow that up, it would not look nearly as dark as it does in that picture-in-picture. And hopefully, what you're doing at home, if you haven't thought of it already, we're seeing this on a computer. You can just access that picture-in-picture while you're watching the video in most programs, and you can blow it up, move it around, really zoom in on it. You can get your picture-in-picture reference to be actually the size of the drawing here if you wanted. Remember too, we're also seeing a very exploded view of this. This foot is much, much larger than it is in real life, in the actual drawing. One of the other things that's good to do too is pull up the final drawing while this video is happening, so you can kind of see what the values are going to be before I start filling in dots, and you can kind of see how much jump there should be between the two. A side-by-side comparison can really help. That's the whole reason why we're doing these videos, is because we don't have access to how historically these drawings looked at different stages. And if the finish is super, super smooth in some of those old paintings and drawings, then it's just almost impossible to tell what some of those stages are. And ultimately, that's kind of our goal with these drawings, is to produce something that's so finished and so refined that it looks more like a classical or academic drawing, in which case, trying to dissect or understand what the process is could be very, very challenging. Now again, the underside of this foot, hard to see in the reference photo. I think it might have been in a slightly different pose for the reference photo. But I can see a little bit of the back toes as well as a hair of the underside where the foot is wrapping around, or wrapping under. Getting in my final lights for the foot. Notice I saved those in for the last, as well as the knee there. I really wanted the look of a solid structure of the foot before adding those final lights in there. And that's one of the advantages. The nice things about working on this toned paper is we're kind of working from the sort of the mid values out. So we're building the lights a little lighter, little lighter, little lighter as we go. And I know it's really hard for most people and most students to resist the temptation to add, that light mark of the foot that right there, to resist that until this stage, because it's so for the most part glaringly obvious when you first look at the reference. But part of that is squinting. We have to squint. We have to squint way down at the very beginning till our eyes are barely open, and then basically as the drawing progresses, we're just opening our eyes and squinting a little less and a little less and a little less, and understanding that to establish good relationships, it's better to save those final acts, or those extreme accents, the lightest lights and the darkest darks, towards the very end.
I would think it would be really common for a student to immediately overshoot the lights on this foot.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, it's really hard, and it's part of it's a matter of isolation a lot. Comparing that foot to the rest of the figure, because if we're working, say, one day on the leg, then by the end of that day, you've usually pushed the lights almost all the way white, the darks almost all the way black, and then it's in no way fits into the rest of this figure drawing. It's really tough. The poster study, again, will help with that, but also just letting your eyes bounce back and forth all over the drawing. Every time you're making a little value change, remember, you have to ask yourself, how does this not only fit into the context of the values in my area, but in the context of the rest of the drawing? Here we go, back now for the head, for the last 40 minutes or so of this drawing. I've already got my box established for the head, so I'm just making sure that it's correct at this point. And I'm also sort of using the neck now as a launching off point. I have developed the neck in relationship to the torso, and so I understand that if I want my head to match the rest of my body, it has to fit on the neck. So we have to be careful here, and even though I may have put a box in originally for the head, I need to understand that, you know, very, very subtle changes, even in, for example, the angle of the neck. The tiniest change in the angle of the neck will change the placement of the head.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it has to remain a little bit more flexible and a little bit more open. A lot of students like to try and carve that head out right away in the very beginning with the initial scheme, and it's something that I strongly discourage, because if we're not starting with the head to render the drawing, and working our way down.
You're just going to end up changing it.
Yeah, you're just going to end up changing. So yeah, anything past a basic box for the head is going to make more work for yourself in the future, most likely. And the head really, as a box when we put it in, it's just for us to sort of see the relationships of the head to the rest of the body and the placement on the page in general. Make sure we're not going to cut the top of the hair off or anything like that running off the page. So I'm trying to use comparative measurements now from the shoulder to where the jaw goes into the neck, and I'm using that as a unit to compare a lot of other stuff too. So I'm checking distances from the neck, heights from the jaw line. I'm just building a lot off of that piece of length right there. So for that, I'll measure on the model something, for example, like, okay, what is the distance from the nose to her chin, and then take that distance and compare it from to the distance of her shoulder to her jaw. And if it's the full distance of the shoulder to the jaw, then I know that's my unit of measurement. If it's like 2/3 of that distance, then I know that's my unit that I'm trying to find, and then I relate it back to my drawing. So I measure off the model, find the relationship to the shoulder to jaw, then I go to mine and get that unit from the shoulder and jaw, and then seek out the measurement I was trying to find. It is kind of a lot of work, but it's necessary. And remember that a lot of these measurements that I'm doing, the comparative measurements, are also just backups for my sight size at this point, because I am still sight sizing. I am still taking a lot of angles, but I'm also doing a lot of comparative measurement. And the reason is because we're now dealing with shapes that are very, very small at angles that are very, very precise. And it's going to require not only that I utilize my sight size, my comparative, my angles, and my plumbs and levels, but also that I keep doing it over and over and over again, especially as I start to build up this drawing. You know, I can't accept that anything I've laid down is correct. I can think that it might be correct and that I hope it's correct and I give it my best shot, but I have to understand that I must be willing to let things change, because if anything is a little bit off with the face, it's going to tell immediately, and so I have to be willing to adjust and willing to fix things as needed. You know, sight size, there's an angle measurement. So keep in mind, at this point I'm doing angle measurements off of parts of the face that I've laid in already, which is good because they all need to lock up, but I also have to understand that if parts of my face are wrong, then it means those angle measurements I take are going to be wrong. So I have to make sure that I back up every angle measurement with some other form of measurement. Boxing in the ear there.
Yeah, I've fallen into, I'm really comfortable with angle measuring, and I definitely have to catch myself regularly not relying on that solely, and I think that's really easy to do.
Absolutely, yeah. It's super fast. I think it's probably one of the fastest ways of taking measurements is just angles. But we have to remember that if we're not doing it off of our anchors, then they could be incorrect.
Right.
And you know, sometimes, especially with a figure or a portrait, our anchors aren't always consistent on the model if there's little changes on the model. So we just have to be careful with that. Just be aware of that.
Right.
And you know, if you can work really, really fast, you know, if we could knock this whole shadow map of a head out in one sitting, and I know the model's not going to move in that one sitting, then I can be pretty confident that angles will probably have worked out well. even on their own to some degree, but I wouldn't trust that enough, to finish this drawing off after spending 20 hours
Yeah.
on this drawing. I'm not going to bank on the fact that, oh yeah, I probably got those angles right when I did them. I'm definitely going to check. And this pose, especially, is not an easy pose for her to hold her head like this. It's pretty challenging. And so, this is the first time for a long time in this pose that she's actually had to do this for me. But it's the pose that I decided I wanted, so we're really trying to go with it. And I am trying to hit this shadow map in the first 20 minutes or 25 or whatever it was sitting with her, and really try and nail it down as strong as I can. And I'm working very, very quickly here. And then as I render it, I might make little changes and adjustments based off of how she might move or whatnot. But if I decide I like something better, but I really want to try and get this in here as accurately as I can. Really, the only thing speed is ever going to do for you is allow you to capture things that are more dynamic, like more challenging, more gestural. That would be difficult to hold for long periods of time. Otherwise, there's no real advantage to speed. If you have, an unlimited time with the model, or a large amount of time with the model, like doing still life, or you have access to a model whenever you need to, there's no real advantage to being able to go really fast. And in fact, going fast will just probably hurt all of your measurements. But when we're in a situation like this where there's a challenging pose, the model has a hard time keeping that pose, or maybe we're outside and the light is changing really, really quickly, then it pays off to be fast. But if you start with the pressure of trying to be fast, or start with these really dynamic poses, or fleeting lighting effects in landscape, then you might end up handicapping yourself, because you're not going to be able to train yourself to see the subtlety required to accurately capture them, because you're in such a rush to try and get it all down.
Yeah, I think people might confuse trying to go fast with proper time management.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah.
I know for me, when we have a model, I'll set mini goals for myself, because I know we're going to be sitting for 20, 25, 30 minutes at a time. Well, what do I know that I can get done in that time? What am I going to push myself to get finished in that time? What am I not going to start when there's 5 minutes left?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. Speed and time management are very, very different, and when we mention stuff like that in class, I think students get on the defensive and say, "Well, I'm just not very fast." But it doesn't matter how fast you are, because you should know your limits and know what you can do in a given amount of time, especially at this point in the program. We've been at this for 30 weeks now. You should have a pretty reasonable idea of what you can accomplish in a 20 or 25-minute setting, especially because even in the very beginning of the program, when we were doing simple barred plates, we were taking breaks at those regular intervals. So you should be aware enough while you're working to have an understanding of how much you can get through, and not biting off, like you said, more than you can chew with only 5 minutes left. Being aware of the time, not getting sidetracked by noodling when it's not time to noodle. There's all that sort of stuff. And certainly, I do think that if you have good time management and are very aware of all that, your speed will probably improve, because you'll just start diverting your efforts to more appropriate goals and work, and that's good management. That's what good time management does for you.
Yeah, I think people hear that this drawing took 20 plus hours, and they might be thinking it's like 20 hours or 18 hours of like noodling.
Right.
and it's all just broken up into increments. So it's not like even though it's a very tight drawing, it's a very clean drawing. 99% of the time spent was not in filling holes. It wasn't.
Right, yeah. It was considerably advancing the drawing
Sure.
in measured increments. You know, there wasn't just mindless back and forth trying to get it right.
Right.
That's the difference there. And you know, I think a lot of students will come in and say something like, "Oh, I spent so long in this drawing," and you know, "Oh, it's the most time I ever spent," or they're proud of how long they spent on it, or you know, even students not in the academy will bring paintings in and say, "Oh, I spent so long in this painting," and it's, well, why did it take you that long? Did it take you that long because you developed the sensitivity and you advanced the drawing further, or because you just pushed it back and forth and back and forth? Because one is good and one is not, and we need to identify that. And if drawings are taking you a long time because of that uncertainty and because of that back and forth, then it's better to figure out what it is you're going back and forth with. Is it the shapes, or is it the values, or is it the edges? Or, you know, identify that so we can tackle it more appropriately. But if you can't identify it, it's going to be really hard to advance forward, and I think that's a big struggle for a lot of students. So I've stumped it in, given myself a base tone, and now I'm going back and lifting some of this off, erasing out, modulating the values here. It got a little dark when I stumped it, and that's okay. Now the tough thing about working with the model here to finish the portrait is I have one session left, which means that unlike the other stages of the drawing, I don't get to take the head home and fill in all the holes. So I really have to try and build in a level of finish that is not too far off the level of finish of the rest of the drawing without that ability to go home and work on it. And so actually, you know, if you look at the final drawing up close or zoom in on it, you will notice that there's more of that sort of abstract paper texture in the face at the end of this drawing than there is in other parts of the drawing. And that's just the nature of how the timing of the model worked out. I do know I was dancing back and forth about the value of the shadow of that sternocleidomastoid there running down behind the ear, that bonnet string muscle there. It goes pretty close to the tone of the paper, and so I thought it was darker, and then I lay all this light in, and then I think I realized it's a little bit lighter, and you know, there I go erasing it out, trying to soften this transition here a bit. Keep in mind, I am still trying to work on the general value of the whole area to create the three-dimensional forms that I see before I get into any fine sculpting with the direction of the strokes or anything. There's a little bit of hair in there. That's something we talked about with the portrait. We have to get our hair highlights not too stringy, more shape-oriented. And then eventually I'll go back and sharpen some of those highlights on the hair. Here I am doing a little bit of filling in, which I have to do to advance this drawing further. There's just no way of getting around it. Luckily, you know, we take breaks with the model. So my 5-minute breaks are spent filling in these holes.
Which if you have a bunch of pencils already sharp, then that works out.
Absolutely, yeah.
Just fine.
Yeah, I think at this point I've got at least 4 or 5 of the white chalk pencils on hand. And then I think maybe 3 or 4 of the HBs. And keep in mind too that this is a very small area of the drawing. You know, very, very tiny head. It's what, maybe 3 inches, 2.5, 3 inches.
I was thinking smaller than that.
It might be 2.5.
2, yeah.
So I'm just working really hard and quickly here to try and fill in all these dots. Just enough to even out some of the areas so I can advance the shading a little bit further.
You're using your binoculars.
A little, well, no, not yet. No, actually, I'm actually closer to the model now. That's a good point. Because I'm alone, I was able to just push my canvas or my easel so that I'm just a few feet from her, and I can actually see these relationships pretty well at this point. And I can sight size easily just by stepping back maybe one step or so instead of 4 or 5 steps like it was before. Now I'm already done filling in, so I'm moving into some more finished refinement of the neck area here. I'm having to relate the neck to the shoulder here and trying to resolve the value, as well as the jump to the hair at this point too. So I'm trying to get all that figured out.
I think hairlines can be a little tricky. At least they have
Yeah.
been for me.
Absolutely. I think the challenge there is to not make it look like a helmet, um, and figure out how soft or hard that edge has to be, how rapid that value jump has to be. Keep in mind that it's gotta fall along with what we talked about before, where you need to have the varied edge quality.
Mm-hmm.
And even right now, I haven't quite developed the whole varied edge quality, and so it looks a little artificial right at the jump from the white chalk to the dark, and so that's something that'll have to get addressed a little bit later. I typically save the hair towards the end and the transition to the hair. But yeah, you have to make sure that the value variation is a little different, that the edge variation is a little different, all the way running down, and also the angle turns. The actual shape has to be a little bit varied, because if it's not, it does just read more like a helmet.
Measuring off the hairline is something that we do. I mean, it's something we do,
Mm-hmm.
but that can also get a little. I mean, I know for myself,
Yeah.
if I'm not really certain of what part of that hairline I'm measuring off of, if a person has a widow's peak, or
Right.
maybe it's a little thinner, so it's kind of ambiguous as to where the skin is starting or stopping and the hair is starting, or whatever.
Yeah.
That can get a little tricky. So
For
I
sure.
think just being really aware of what point exactly you're looking at.
And if it's too ambiguous, to just leave it out.
Absolutely.
Not utilize it as a method
Definitely.
to measure. And that falls into one of those things too, where students will say, "But last week you told me to measure off of the hairline, and this week you're telling me not to." And well, last week it was very, very clear.
Mm-hmm.
This week the model's blonde and the hair matches the
Mm-hmm.
skin color, and there's no real noticeable point. So those are the decisions that you have to make for yourself. And each time you have to ask yourself, does it make sense to do this? Does it make sense to measure off this point in this situation? Does it make sense to use a value as an anchor within the model for this drawing, or is it not dark enough? Do I need to go somewhere else? We have to keep in mind that some of the concepts should run along. For example, you have to have anchors from a clear point, but some of the finer details of those concepts, like where is your anchor that you're measuring off of, are the things that are going to change, and we need to make sure that they're not too dogmatic, or else we could run into some issues. And I do understand that there's a lot of security in a standard process that doesn't deviate. That's why a lot of students like this academy so much, especially in the very beginning. Everybody gets really jazzed in the beginning, the first term when we're doing barred plates and master copies, because it's no nonsense. This is what you do it all the time, and it works out. And that works great until we start to encounter real world situations in which you have to use that training combined with your best judgment to decide when and if you should deviate from the process. And that's where it becomes trickier, and that's where it starts to get really frustrating for students. But unfortunately, I can only offer, in these videos we see, a variety of situations and a variety of solutions. But I tend to find that the students who do best in the program are those who have the ingenuity to think outside the box when it's appropriate. Those problem solvers. People who start businesses and have successful independent businesses because they've solved problems, or people who can fashion fixes for their house or car out of whatever's lying around. You know, those are the thinkers that tend to do really well when we get into more complex subjects like this, just because they understand some of the shortcomings of following a super rigid process all of the time. You know, we can do that, and we could probably have some decent results, but it might not always be the most efficient thing to do. I'm getting into some core shadow here in the face. Again, this is one instance where the photo is not quite telling us all the information, but I'm getting a little more core shadow in here to help turn the face just a little bit more, give it a little more form, which I felt was kind of necessary because I did flesh out the form a lot in the rest of the drawing, and I felt that if I didn't have, for example, enough of a core shadow here, the head wouldn't look as round as I needed it to look to match the rest of the figure. So I've got some areas there where I've pushed the core just a little bit more than in the reference. But that's okay. You know, sometimes we have to do that. And that's a decision we have to make. And that's one of the liberties as artists that we can make if we decide, in my best judgment, you know, for example, that I needed that head to be a little more round. Keep in mind, too, the camera at this stage is, I think, pushing the value contrast a little bit more too. That hair is a bit darker, actually, and the darks in the face are a bit darker than the actual drawing. And so, you know, in this case, for example, it does look like the core shadow is darker than it is. It does look like the hair is darker than it is. So keep that in mind. You know, refer back to the finished drawing. Also to see the actual values that are getting laid down there. Just fine-tuning that eye. That eye is really tricky. I'm seeing just a sliver of the cheek there. And, you know, as the model is sitting there trying to hold this pose, it goes back and forth. You know, I'll see a little bit more nose, a little bit less nose, a little bit more eye socket, a little bit less eye socket. So you see me change that around just a little bit here, seeking that out. You know, you get the eye socket a little too large, head might look cartoony, a little too small, then the rest of the features look large and awkward by comparison. Yeah, so gotta sort of dance that line. The mouth too, you know, especially this particular pose, I think could be really challenging for a lot of people. She's got her head leaned back toward the wall, you know, just a little bit, so the right side of that mouth is significantly higher than the left side of that mouth. I have to take a lot of plums. That angle's changed a little bit in my drawing as I tried to refine it out a little bit more. And there's really not a whole lot of lips showing. You know, the more you stare at it, the more you realize how little information is being shown in that mouth area. I'm still not even happy with the eye placement at this point, lowering the socket just a little bit. That's one of the first things I go to. If I decide that a head is starting to look too cartoony, I'll check the eyes. First of all, big eyes tend to have a cartoony effect. And then the second thing to check is if I've rounded out too many angles, especially with females. You know, females with rounder shapes, we tend to put more curved lines. That makes things look cartoony right away. Got to catch that. And then the third and final thing that I tend to really check on is the value structure, because if you overextend the value structure, things look a little too round, which can again make things look a little too cartoony. Older people can tend to look more kid-like. If you push that value structure too much, it looks like they've got all that baby fat on them, all the big, you know, full cheeks and things. So we have to really be aware.
I feel like edges could do that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, if there's too many harder edges, then it's almost like this clay-like.
Yeah, it can start to look graphic almost if you've got too many hard edges, right? But then if you have too many soft edges, it looks frothy and out of focus. You know, edges are a really tough thing, and I wish I could get you know, students to think about them more, because you know, again, even if your values and your shapes are great, edges are really going to pull you down if you're not aware of them. And they can just be so subtle. And of all the things we talk about, they're the least measurable. You know, we can't as easily hold up a, you know, a scale of edge quality. We have one in the textbook. There's a little bit of that scale, so you can kind of see the difference. But it's a lot tougher to make the decision for yourself, especially when you get in a little fine-tuned observations, you know, building up a relationship of edges in the face here, for example, where almost everything's in shadow. It's really, really tough, and you have to just bounce your eyes back and forth and all around, and try to really be critical about the edge quality and compare it. We're building up this huge set of if this edge quality, then this edge quality relationships on here, and we have to make sure that they all match or our drawing falls apart. And unfortunately, you know, with shapes, we can do a lot of precise measuring. We do the box and the anchors, and we can really measure that out. With values, we can at least start with the poster study and sort through a lot of that right away and establish those relationships. Edges, you know, we don't really have a study that we can do to figure that out, and it's just, you know, you have to squint and be aware and be aware and be more aware and more aware. And hopefully have that awareness start right in the beginning of the process, and not just save it as an afterthought. And I know some people do that. They'll work the whole like open studio, and then at the very end they go to adjust the edges, and it can be really tricky to do that. Actually, in painting, we can actually do that to a degree. We'll see how we do that. But in drawing, you kind of have to work them to a degree as you go along and not forget about them, or you can run into some issues later.
Yeah, I think for me, I've noticed edges have definitely been challenging, which I like, said in the past. But I've noticed it's not necessarily that I'm not observing them properly, but it's the technique of making it happen on my paper. And so the other day, you actually showed me something that was obvious and made complete sense, to just erase out harder and go back in, like say I'm trying to get a harder edge, you know, erase out maybe a little harder than I was, using my eraser in a different way than I was, and going back in with a really sharp pencil. It's something as simple as that.
Right.
Technique has completely changed my experience. So, and that's so great about the instruction.
Right. And, you know, we might actually see a little bit of that technique here in the hair. You can kind of notice the hair is all sort of fuzzy as it goes around. So instead of just going in and trying to draw a line around the hair, which wouldn't actually improve the sharpness very much.
And would grow the shape.
And would grow the shape, right? We can just take our eraser and erase from the background and cut into the hair, clean up all that haze around it, and then go back in and crisp the edge and flush it out as needed, flush the shape out. Yeah, that's great. Also, you know, we have to have the sharp pencils. I think that's, you know, again, we've talked about that, one of students' biggest hang-ups. And then the third thing I think holding students back a lot from edges is just going to be this idea of how much they've filled in the paper and created a nice, even value quality on their drawing. Like if you don't fill in all these dots, if you don't make this, you know, value and shape values even by filling in all the holes, then it's going to be really hard to create an edge quality just because there's just so much jumping around of values and so much unevenness on there. It ends up being a very simplified set of edge qualities that you can make. And so if you want to take up the sensitivity, build it up, and advance it to the next level, you have to do all that filling in of dots and you know, cleaning up of the page, and then come in with the sharp pencil and start crisping up those edges in there. You can see I just threw in the lighter light on the neck here to help push it all the way out. It wasn't quite light enough in relation to the shoulder yet, so now it's a lot closer. And then just with a sharp pencil, that's what I'm doing now. I'm going back in and adjusting some edge qualities in the ear, and now in the hair, just softening the transition between the hair and the skin. I'm to the point now where I'm feeling pretty confident in the face. And so everything I do now are just these final little touches. Like I noticed there a softer edge between the ear and the head, where the ear was looking a little too cut out or a little too disjointed from the head behind it. So I had to erase out, soften that edge quality a little bit. Then we have to develop this transition here, which we talked about. So I've erased out. I'm trying to stump a little bit in to get some of the top layer of that white over into the hairline. And then adjust the shape and then adjust the edge quality of that hairline. I noticed the shape was actually a little bit off. The hair was coming down a little low. And keep in mind too, we're at the stage now, the level of finish where I can start to overlap some of my white chalk and my charcoal, sort of interlock them if I don't think that it's going to, if I don't think they're going to actually physically mix. The last couple minutes, I've really got to resolve some of this hair. At this point, I have made the decision that I will not have time for the background with the model. I will not have time to render out the cloth with the model. So I've seen the cloth in a variety of different positions at this place, so I'm just going to rely on all that studies of draperies we did in term 2 to create some of the folds that I remember from some other poses here. Now, as I lay in and reinforce some of the light highlights in the hair, I'm, again, not trying to make them match exactly to the model, especially because as any small change happens, highlights change. And so I'm just trying to get the overall direction of the highlights to match and treat them as shapes, if I can, and not little tiny strings. I do have a couple marks that could be perceived as individual hairs, but for the most part, the majority of it are more solid shapes, and I'm trying to connect those shapes whenever I can. Trying to capture that subtle value change from the top of the hair down. Again, here I'm just trying to really take little top pieces of the charcoal or chalk that I have with the stump and lift it off a little bit to facilitate some of those transitions. And here now, I've got an HB. You can see I'm going and I'm crisping in these highlights now to help them really read as highlights. If they're too soft or mushy, then it won't look like highlights in the hair. It'll just look like strange, awkward streaks. And since I'm working with the HB now, I'm also able to come in here and make a few of the individual marks here, like little wisps of hair to give it that final hair look. Remember, you don't want to have it as one solid mass. It's got to be an actual natural feel. Now I'm done with the model. She is no longer with me. So I have decided that instead of opting to erase or fill in the whole background, I'm just going to erase out all of the contextual marks I made, which happens to me a lot actually, especially with painting. I decide that I just don't like the color that was up there behind the model, and so I want to erase it out. I have to ask myself, is there an advantage to putting the background in here? In this case, I don't necessarily think there is. The towel or the sheet or whatever it is that's on the bench she's sitting on isn't super attractive anyway. There's not really anything happening with the background, and in fact, if I don't have her to see the cast shadow that's behind her, then the background is kind of useless. Mm-hmm. So I would rather just have it be a cleaner, even toning in there as much as I can. So I'm working the white eraser a lot, the click eraser. That big bulky one you saw me take out is also made by Generals, and it's actually the same eraser as this click one here. It's just bigger for bigger, broader shapes, which is nice. So I'm just working in here and trying to get out as much as I can. At this point, I'm not even trying to get the little white schmuggums off. I'm just leaving them on while I try and erase everything out here. Here I'm trying to take the white off. Notice I'm not stumping in there. I'm just trying to remove with my stump the little pieces of white eraser. And I did end up inadvertently erasing some of the marks leading into the hand. So I've gone and crisped those up, relaid down some of the darks of the occlusion where it's hitting the actual table, which of course I'm having to do off of memory. But as I erase, I see it looks a little strange, and so I rely on my memory as well as my knowledge of shadows and occlusion shadows. I've also erased out the fabric. It was a little too dark and undescriptive. So I decided to erase it, make it a little more neutral like the background, and throw in some of those curves that I remember. I can also erase my box at this point. I finally am done with it. So we're going to try and keep this as clean as we can. And actually what you'll see me do after I get off the majority of these little eraser guys is I'll come in here and I'll actually, anywhere where I couldn't erase off the white chalk all the way, you'll actually see I'll go in and I'll fill in a few dots, do a little veils to bring up the value of that area that the white chalk didn't come off all the way. And given more time, I'd probably go and I'd clean this up even more and make the whole paper tone an even value. Crisp up some of those edges there. So I'm just trying to match the paper tone here with the pencil, just overall. It's again, how much time do I want to spend? And so that's the drawing, and that's it.
Beautiful, Tim.